July 21, 1999, Huntsville, Alabama. Inside NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, an engineer freezes. His monitor displays a terrifying message. Unauthorized access detected. Files related to the International Space Station's life support systems are gone. A few hundred miles away, Pentagon analysts are staring at their own nightmare. Classified emails are vanishing, intercepted mid-transit. Passwords, military passwords, stolen in real time. To officials, this looks like the work of a foreign power. Russia, maybe China, a hostile nation probing America's most sensitive systems. But the truth is stranger and far more unsettling. The source of this breach isn't an enemy government. It isn't a team of spies in some distant bunker. It's a suburban teenager sitting in his bedroom in Miami, Florida. His name was Jonathan James. Online, he was known as Comrade, and at just 15 years old, he would become the first juvenile in U.S. history convicted of cybercrime. A boy genius who hacked NASA and the Pentagon before he was old enough to drive a car. This is his story, the rise, the fall, and the tragedy of the boy who hacked the world. Jonathan Joseph James was born on December 12, 1983 in Pinecrest, a small village in Miami-Dade County, Florida. His father was a computer programmer. His mother, a homemaker, raised him and his siblings in a modest suburban home. Jonathan was different from the start. At just 6 years old, while other kids were outside playing tag or baseball, he was inside, fascinated by the strange machine sitting on his father's desk, a personal computer. For most families, it was a novelty. For Jonathan, it was destiny. He wasn't just playing video games. By 8 years old, he was taking apart the very code that made them run. He learned programming languages like C. He studied Linux systems and Unix commands before most kids even knew what the internet was. But brilliance came with isolation. Jonathan wasn't the popular kid at school. He was awkward, quiet, and often misunderstood. Computers gave him something. He hacked into his school's grading system, adjusted marks, tweaked his report card, and then, in a move that stunned even his parents, he used it to blackmail them into giving his computer back. Imagine being 12 years old and already pulling off exploits your teachers couldn't even comprehend. But this wasn't just a prank. Jonathan's skills were evolving. He began to haunt internet relay chat rooms, IRC, the dark digital gathering places where hackers, freakers, and cyber outlaws shared exploits. Here, he adopted the name Comrade, a name that would soon spread across underground forums and FBI watch lists alike. He wasn't interested in chaos. He wasn't a vandal. Jonathan's hacks were precise, calculated, and before long, Comrade would set his sights far beyond school systems. In February of 1999, Jonathan targeted Bell South, one of the largest telecommunications companies in the United States. Using a vulnerability in outdated Solaris systems, he slipped quietly inside their servers. For 4 hours, Jonathan roamed undetected through Bell South's infrastructure. He could see customer databases, employee records, private emails. He had the keys to the kingdom. But here's what made Jonathan different. He didn't sell the data. He didn't destroy anything. He didn't even copy most of it. For him, this was a rehearsal, a test, proof that he could infiltrate billion-dollar corporations and walk away unseen. It was practice for something far bigger. Something that would shake NASA to its core. NASA, the crown jewel of American technology, the agency responsible for space exploration, satellites, and the International Space Station. To Jonathan James, it was the ultimate challenge. On June 29, 1999, Jonathan exploited a vulnerability in a NASA server at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Within just 17 minutes, he had root access. And these weren't ordinary machines. They contained software tied directly to the International Space Station's life support systems. Code that controlled oxygen levels, carbon dioxide removal, and temperature regulation. survival systems for astronauts orbiting hundreds of miles above the Earth. Jonathan downloaded 38 megabytes of proprietary code, software worth an estimated $1.7 million. NASA had no choice but to shut down operations for 3 weeks. Engineers worked around the clock to examine the breach, costing the agency over $40,000 in damages and unmeasurable embarrassment. The code itself was crappy, certainly not worth $1.7 million. I just wanted to see how the government wrote in C. Jonathan James. But while Jonathan was busy studying NASA's code, another target was already in his sights, one far more dangerous: the Pentagon. August 1999. Jonathan set his focus on the U.S. Department of Defense, specifically the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the division responsible for monitoring and responding to nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. Using a vulnerability in a router, he planted a sniffer program, silent, invisible. It captured every piece of data flowing through the network. Over 3,300 sensitive messages, 19 user accounts, including military logins, passwords, emails, plans. Among them were details about satellite operations, nuclear contingency plans, and advanced weapons research. Information that, in the wrong hands, could compromise national security. To Jonathan, it was a trophy. Proof of his skill. He encrypted the data, stored it as a badge of honor. But to the Pentagon, it was a catastrophic breach, one of the most serious civilian penetrations in U.S. history. And for the FBI, it was a declaration of war. By October, the Pentagon launched Flashpoint Alpha, its highest cyber alert. A task force of FBI agents, NASA security, and military investigators traced the attacks through 17 proxy servers across 9 countries. Jonathan was careful, meticulous, but even the best hackers slip. A single 3-second direct connection exposed his true IP address, a suburban home in Pinecrest, Florida. On January 26, 2000, at 4:30 in the morning, 15 agents stormed the James residence. They found Jonathan at his desk, headphones on, typing. He looked up calmly as the door burst open. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said. The FBI seized everything. 13 hard drives, 3 laptops, 2 desktops, CDs, floppies, even his Sharp Wizard organizer. Inside a spiral notebook, investigators found handwritten logs of 89 different intrusions. The boy who hacked NASA and the Pentagon was finally caught. On September 21, 2000, Jonathan stood before Judge Barry Garber in the Southern District of Florida. He faced charges that carried up to 10 years in prison each. But Jonathan wasn't an adult. He was 15 when he committed the crimes. Judge Garber weighed rehabilitation against punishment. In the end, Jonathan became the first juvenile convicted of cybercrime in U.S. history. He served 6 months in a federal juvenile facility, 3 years of probation, mandatory community service, and a ban on recreational computer use until his 18th birthday. Inside detention, Jonathan filled notebook after notebook with nearly 50,000 words on security. He argued that human behavior, not machines, was the weakest link in any system. His writings, some say, influenced cybersecurity training for years afterward. But when Jonathan walked free, the world he returned to wasn't ready. Jonathan's story wasn't happening in a vacuum. At the very same time, a hacker named Albert Gonzalez, alias Soup Nazi, was building one of the most profitable cybercrime empires ever seen. Through a network called Shadow Crew, Gonzalez and his associates stole over 180 million credit card numbers. They hacked retailers like TJX, OfficeMax, Dave & Buster's. Using sniffer programs and war driving, they raked in hundreds of millions in stolen data. It was the largest credit card theft in history. Gonzalez would eventually be sentenced to 20 years in prison, the harshest cybercrime sentence at the time. But Jonathan's case was different. Gonzalez was motivated by greed. Jonathan was motivated by curiosity. Yet in the eyes of law enforcement, They were two sides of the same threat. Young men who had weaponized code against the world's most powerful systems. After serving his sentence, Jonathan struggled to rebuild his life. He never went to college. He worked odd retail jobs. His friends drifted away. His mother died of breast cancer, leaving him even more isolated. In 2007, after the massive TJX breach, federal investigators suspected Jonathan might still have ties to Gonzalez. In 2008, his home was raided again. To Jonathan, it was confirmation that no matter what he did, the government would never stop hunting him. He told friends he felt trapped, that his future was gone. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead in his Florida home. A self-inflicted gunshot wound ended his life at just 24 years old. In his suicide note, Jonathan wrote, "I honestly don't see how this is going to work out. I have no faith in the justice system. Perhaps my actions today and this letter will send a stronger message to the public. Either way, I have lost control of this situation, and this is my only way to regain it." A brilliant hacker, a curious mind, a young man who believed he would never escape. Jonathan James remains a tragic figure in the history of hacking. The boy who breached NASA and the Pentagon, not for money, not for power, but for knowledge. His story raises questions that remain unanswered. What happens when brilliance is punished instead of nurtured? Was Jonathan James a criminal or a warning? A threat to national security or a glimpse into the future of cyber warfare? In the end, Comrade wasn't just a hacker. He was a reminder that genius and tragedy often share the same line of code. This is the story of Jonathan James.